The Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair.
Good morning. So we're in the early part of our series on Isaiah 61, and if you're following in the church Bibles, we're on page 755, or if you're following on a device, then do turn it on, because it would be great to see with me the verses that we're looking at. So it's Isaiah 61, and it's those early verses, verse 1 to the first part of verse 3, page 755. And this is all about relief, restoration, and justice. Relief, restoration, and justice. Now imagine waking up one morning, drawing back the curtains, and seeing a different world to the one you knew the night before. There should be a slide on the area. The telly's not on at the back, so I didn't realise they were on. Okay, so imagine that. You wake up to a different world. That, of course, is what's happened very recently to the people of Ukraine. And it's also what happened to the Israelites in the 6th century BC. Their experience of pain and sorrow has been or is like nothing before. And in these few lines from Isaiah, God promises them and God promises us that no matter how great the pain and sorrow, firstly, God is with us to comfort and to bind up broken hearts. God is with us. And secondly, God is working to bring complete relief, restoration, and justice. And thirdly, God asks us to join him in proclaiming and providing relief, restoration, and justice. So it's a somber message, but it's real. And it's life-giving news for those who suffer either physically or psychologically or spiritually. God operates on all three levels. And to be honest, who of us has got it all in order in all three areas of life? So this is good news for all of us. So God, the Comforter. God knows the desperate situation of people. Just look at the words in this passage. He sends his anointed messenger in verse 1 to who? To the poor. He has sent me, he says, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. In verse 2, to comfort those who mourn and to provide for those who grieve. And in verse 3, to those with a spirit of despair. When Russia invaded Ukraine, I couldn't believe what was happening. Like a lot of us, I was stunned. And I began following a daily BBC podcast to hear and imagine and get into the shoes of those who were experiencing that distress firsthand. To hear of people whose lives are being devastated. Cities destroyed, loved ones killed, many injured, people forced from their homes. For many Ukrainians, life has been reduced to a pile of ashes. Well, their experience that we're hearing of brings the turmoil of the Israelites closer to home. In the 6th century BC, invaders from Babylon attacked Jerusalem, killed many, and carried off the survivors into exile. Life for the Israelites had been reduced to a pile of ashes. But then in 538 BC, just 9 years later, I say just, a whole 9 years later, the exiles were allowed to return home. And this is the moment that Isaiah 61 speaks into. The Persian Emperor Cyrus had defeated the Babylonians and allowed the Israelites to return back to Jerusalem. So on one hand, this sounds like a message of great joy, something to be celebrated. Imagine the people of Ukraine being told, the war's over, you can go home. On one hand, that's great. But what are they going home to? What are they going to see when they get there? Cities are still destroyed, perhaps returning home without all of their family. The jobs they once had no longer there. A lot of sorrow and a lot of grief still. Not only that, but the psychological trauma that goes with it. You can't just go back to your home and your job as if nothing happened. And so too the Israelites, as they returned to Jerusalem, they faced ruins. The city walls had fallen, the temple had been destroyed, the farmland that they once owned and worked on was now being worked on by other people who'd moved in and taken over. They felt grief and despair. Where is God in all this mess? And that's a good question. Where is God in all this mess? It may have been a surprise to the Israelites to hear these words describing God's anointed rescuer. Earlier in Isaiah's vision, God had been described as a mighty warrior. But this messenger now comes who is a little bit more nurse-like. It's surely not the king's job to bandage up the wounded, to have a heart-to-heart with those who are feeling down, to provide emotional support. Surely that's not the king's job, a mighty warrior's job. Who is this? This anointed rescuer is later revealed to be Jesus himself. He identifies himself in Luke 4 with these words. At that moment when Jesus first preaches in his local synagogue, he could have chosen any passage of Scripture as his first sermon. And this is what happens, Luke 4 verse 16. Does he align himself with mighty warrior or mighty counselor? He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." God is with those who are hurting, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. Jesus comes as the Prince of Peace, the mighty counselor. Isaiah 61 paints a picture of those in desperate pain, in desperate sorrow. If God is able to comfort people who have suffered so much, then surely there's nothing we can face that's too big for him. But equally, nothing too small that's not worthy of his attention. What do we need to bring to God this morning? What are we holding? What are we handling? What are we struggling with? Physically, psychologically, spiritually, that we can bring to God this morning? The God of comfort. But God's not just a God of comfort. God is also a God of restoration. In verse 2, it says that he came, that this messenger, this anointed rescuer, came to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Now, when I was a student, I used to get summer jobs for the long summer holidays, earn some cash for the next term. And one of my favourite jobs was being a labourer for a builder. Got to learn all sorts of things, didn't know what I was doing at all. And we used to jump in his van each day during one particular summer. I was living in York at the time, and we'd head into the Yorkshire Dales. And there was this particular cottage that we were working on. Now, it was an old battered cottage to look at. You know, the tiles were falling off the roof, the windows were boarded up or broken, some of the stonework was missing. And really, the owner had a choice, either to have that cottage demolished or restored. And this particular owner had a vision for it to be restored. And God has a similar vision for his people. God knows the world is not right. He looks at the mess, he's in it and comforts those that are suffering, but he says more than that. God is in the business of relief and restoration and justice. And I loved being a labourer that summer and just playing a very small part in restoring this building to its former glory. Probably just mixing cement and sweeping the floor, that kind of thing, but playing a little role in it. God has a vision for a world that is so much better than that we see around us. He desires to restore each life to its full glory because he sees each one of us as precious, as valuable, and worth it. The anointed messenger of Isaiah in verse 2 was to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Now, you wouldn't know what that was simply by reading Isaiah 61, but it's a reference to Leviticus 25, the year of the Lord's favour, or the year of liberty, or the year of Jubilee. It was meant to be a period every 50 years when, if you were in financial difficulty, you may have taken out great loans and found yourself in debt. Or you may have sold your land. Or you may even have gone as far as sold yourself as a servant or a slave to someone else. And so this great inequality develops, where the rich become richer, landowners take on more land, those with money are able to lend with interest, and the poor become poorer. And God hates that. That's not the design God has for the world. And so he sets up this ideal model where every 50 years things would be restored to their natural order, their status that he's given people. And every 50 years, the idea was that anyone in debt would be released of their debts. Anyone who's given away land would have their land returned to them. Anyone who'd become a slave would be released from slavery. But it was an instruction that was never followed. Not to that degree. And so Jesus coming in, or Isaiah saying that there's this time coming. The year of Jubilee is coming. So for all of those Israelites who are walking around looking at ruins, they've lost their land to others, they've got no money, they've got no jobs. This phrase, I'm proclaiming the year of Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favour, to them is, your status will be restored. It won't be like this forever. I'm restoring all things. All things will be new. You're worth it. I'm not just comforting you, I'm alongside you, and I'm rebuilding your life with you. And Jesus says, now I bring the time of the Lord's favour. It starts now. And Jesus shows how lives can become physically and emotionally and spiritually transformed. For some people, it happened right there, right then, didn't it? For some, Jesus literally gave sight to the blind. For others, well, their new eyes are going to come in the new creation when God makes the whole world new, where there be no more pain, no more suffering, where anything that's broken will be fixed. If you're an Israelite walking around a ruined city, if you're a Ukrainian seeing a home being destroyed, knowing that there's a day that all things will be restored and that justice will come, gives you such hope, doesn't it, to carry on? Not to know, not to realize that anything's ever going to change is so depressing, so much harder. And so this vision to the Israelites at this very difficult time in their lives is life-giving. And it's the same for us. Whatever struggles we go through, physically, emotionally, spiritually, It won't always be like this. God's with us in it, but God's also in the business of complete relief, restoration, and justice. And we experience some of it now. We experience it partially now, and it will one day be fulfilled in the new creation. It will be complete. The year of the Lord's favor. But how is any of that possible? It's possible because this mighty warrior and this mighty counselor are the same person, Jesus. This mighty counselor needed the strength of a warrior to step onto a cross and experience the spirit of despair that his people experience, and to cry out, "Father, why do you forsake me?" That's the cry of someone in complete anguish and despair. Someone who experienced the sensation of God being far away. He traded places with us. He took on our status so that we might take on his status. In the 6th century BC, people would put ashes on their head as a sign of grief or sorrow. Jesus essentially takes on our ashes, our grief, our sorrow, and gives us a crown of beauty. The oil of joy, garments of praise. If we bring everything to God, we can give up our debt, our spiritual debt. We can give up our losses. We can let go of anything that's holding us back physically, emotionally, or spiritually. Anything that enslaves us. And we can take on that status of children of God, highly cherished and loved, highly prized. God says we're worth it, and one day we'll be completely restored. So God is with us in our struggles. God comforts us. But he's also working to bring complete relief, restoration, and justice. And God asks that we join him in that business. It's our role to join in too. In this interim period that Jesus has begun to usher in, this year of the Lord's favor, until all things are made new, we're to join in with him, helping transform lives and transform communities in these ways, corporately as a church and individually in our own lives. Now, I love that this church has been for years committed to ministries that do both. Ministries that provide on a very practical level and also proclaim God's goodness. Ministries like CAP that help people to become free of debt, but also help people to explore what life with Jesus might look like. Ministries like Pathway that serve very practical needs and also point to what life with Jesus can look like. But what does it look like for each one of us in our daily lives? To be committed to proclaiming and providing, to pursue relief, restoration, and justice. Well, I don't know what you do Monday to Friday, but if you work with customers, perhaps it's treating every customer the same, not just the ones that you most admire, but also the ones that appear to be more scruffy or a pain in the neck, to treat them the same. Maybe for me, it's to treat all my neighbours the same. Just because Brad Shields, the captain of Wasps, happens to be just down the street, I shouldn't always be staring through his windows and trying to get a quick word with him and see how he is, but maybe to do that with my other neighbours too. He's just moved out this week, actually. It's like a big part of my life has gone. But I treat them all the same. I should. And if we're in a workplace, it's not just talking to those more senior and giving them special attention, but talking to those more junior and giving them the same amount of time and attention too. I wonder what it looks like for you in your relationships, in your neighborhoods, in your workplaces, wherever you are, Monday to Friday, say, to pursue relief and restoration and justice. Perhaps it's providing a room for a refugee. It could take all shapes, all forms. Andy Metcalf's kindly agreed to share a little bit about what it looks like in his working week. So Andy, why don't you come and join me for a couple of minutes?
Thanks, Tim. I haven't really prepared this at all. But, so Tim asked me to talk about what delivering justice in my own secular work looks like. And of course, most of us are in secular roles. And so how does our daily working life impact on delivering justice in this sense of Isaiah? Well, for me, many of you will know half of my working life is working as a surgeon, but half of my working life is in medical research. And in the research I do, we test new interventions and new treatments to see if they really work and actually help people. And sometimes they really do, and sometimes they don't. And in the sense of justice for people, that means that actually we need to know when some things are actually causing people harm or doing them no good, and people are profiting off that. Equally, we also need to know that some things that are really good are used for everyone and can be used universally around the country, because actually there's a huge inequality of access around the country for some things. Now, to do that, to deliver justice in that sense, well, how do I do that? Well, I need to make sure that what I do is fair and transparent and open, and that I'm willing to suspend my own pride in my, what I do, in order to deliver answers that actually make a difference for people. Now, that's one practical example of how, we talk about how justice is, you think of justice like a court or a legal justice or something, but delivering justice can be about, making sure that people are treated equally or fairly, or the way that we deliver our work is done in a just way, so that people benefit fully from what we do. And I think it's just a reflection that that's a different view of justice that hopefully is helpful in understanding what you're trying to say.
So it can be all too easy to think about how do we reflect God's character and God's desire for pursuing relief and restoration and justice in a ministry role, in a paid ministry role, but actually so many of us are in roles where we can be channels of God's ministry and channels of God's desire for relief and restoration and justice. So to remind you, no matter how great the pain and the sorrow, God is with us in it. He comforts and he binds the brokenhearted. God is working to bring complete relief, restoration, and justice. And God asks us to join him in proclaiming and delivering relief, restoration, and justice. Amen.